Hello, welcome to my channel. Let's get rambling. Today I want to ramble about small towns, small border towns and their identities. I'm currently in Cillian, which is a small town on the border between Italy and Austria, in Austria. And I've been here a couple of times already, and it looks pretty much the way I left it last time I visited. That is to say, quite lifeless, not very lively. Of course, it doesn't help that I start the video in a cemetery. But anyway, by all means, this is your run-of-the-mill border town in Austria. And by all means, it does look Austrian. I mean, it does look so in the architecture and the landscape, I guess. The care, I mean, you can see this is Austria. This is a wealthy, orderly country. So you could say that the identity of this town is quite clearly defined. Well, today I want to argue against that, against the identity of border towns. Or if not arguing at once, I want to at least bring some nuance to it. Indeed, I think the subject of border towns is one that I can talk about with a certain experience, because I realize that I've lived in border areas for much of my life. I mean, for many years. I would say that I've spent a third of my life in border towns or border areas where two different cultures share a border. And I'm going to start with the first such place, the first such border area, which is the border between French-speaking Belgium and Flemish or Dutch-speaking Belgium. You know that Belgium is divided into those two areas, although there's also a small German-speaking area actually, but it's not really taken into account, I guess. And I used to live just on the border in Flemish territory, Dutch-speaking territory, just outside Brussels. I mean, Brussels is a city that is mostly French-speaking, but it is geographically speaking, inside Flemish territory. And I lived in a small town as a kid. Actually, those were my first years, my children years, and part of my teen years. I spent them in this town, which is just outside Brussels. I mean, you could say that it's really the suburbs of Brussels, because it is literally 10 kilometers from, not even 10, from the city proper. So you could argue that it was actually, and it was part of the metropolitan area of Brussels. Physically, it was indeed. Culturally, administratively too, it was a completely different world, actually. It was by all means Flanders, and it definitely made it a point to assert that Flemish identity. I mean, we're talking about a town, this is something I'm going to remember throughout my life, I guess, where at the entrance of the town you have a big board. I used to see it every time I entered the town, or left it indeed, as a kid, a big board saying small town. I'm not going to say the name of the town, doesn't matter, but small town where Flemings are home. You know, to express this fact that that was their fatherland. That is where the Flemish people had found its Lebensraum. Lebensraum? I don't know. No, should I dare using that term? Maybe not, especially not in a Germanic country that's quite happily so, proceeded with being Anschlussed into the Lebensraum of another Germanic superpower. I'm rambling, dangerously so, so back to the point. That town, that border town on the Flemish French-speaking border, was quite hostile, I guess, to, well, mostly to French speakers. I remember that in the city hall, you would only be addressed in Flemish. I mean, if you try to speak in French, they would answer to you, reluctantly so, by the way, in Dutch. You could try in English, that worked, you know, but you could never ask a question in French in a country where actually French is an official language, and where it's been the ruling language, by the way, for many years, which is actually where the bitterness comes from. You know, the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium for the first 100 years, 120 years of the kingdom's history, because it's a kingdom. The Flemish were, you know, pretty much discriminated by the French elite. I mean, the French speakers were ruling over them. I mean, they were treating them as second-class citizens. But then after the war, after the old industries of French-speaking Belgium pretty much failed, the tables turned, because Flanders became a very dynamic region. Today it is one of the richest, most innovative areas, I guess, in Europe, whereas the French-speaking area is declining and trying to reconnect somehow, but definitely a problematic area of Europe. And so yeah, that's where the bitterness comes from, on behalf of the Flemish. And in that small town, I could very much feel it. You know, me and my friends, my French-speaking friends, who look at this. This does look like Austria. This kind of inspire, I don't know, the Austrian stereotype to me, I guess. Anyway, none of us were even, or hardly any of us in my gang of friends, I remember, were even Belgian or native French-speaking Belgians. That was the irony, you know. We all came from different backgrounds mostly, and we used French as our lingua franca, because most of us went to school in French in Brussels. But regardless, that was enough to be hated by the Flemish kids for using that then French language in their fatherland. And I remember that we used to troll them even, you know. We used to go in this bar. It was a bar with all the local youth, the local nationalistic youth, actually. You know, I mean, it was a small town. There weren't that many options. But we would go there and order un Coca-Cola, s'il vous plaît, in French, you know, at the counter, which wasn't welcome very well by the locals. Anyway, why did they do this? Because clearly they wanted to assert their Flemish identity. And that's going to be kind of the point, I hope, of my video. The question of identity in small border towns. Another experience I had living on a border town happened recently, and that was on the Italian-Swiss border. I've been living for a few years in a small town in Italy, just next to Switzerland. Pretty much the same story. I mean, the same context, at least, as in Belgium, in that it was the last town before the border, and on a lake. So anyway, there was a continuation, you know, between the two territories, which there always is, you know, with those I mean, often, at least with those border towns. It's not like there's a big physical separation. In Belgium, there's literally nothing. There's no landmark on the border between the Flemish and the French-speaking world. It's just totally flat, you know. There's just a sign telling you that you're now in Flanders or in Wallonia. Anyway, in that town on the Italian-Swiss border, well, the transition between the two places was kind of visible, I have to say, because Italy is still a rich country, even though it's declining, but it really has a problem with urban planning more generally, but definitely so with maintenance, you know. I mean, Italy is, like I said, quite relatively rich, but in many instances it looks like the freaking second world, you know, because it's just badly kept, you know. The streets are messy. I mean, it's dirty. The things are just run down, you know. It looks much worse than it actually is. It just doesn't take care of its stuff, I mean. And of course, on the border between Italy and Switzerland, you can spot that difference immediately. There was I mean, here we are with here's a bridge, okay? This bridge over the river. At some point on that border there where I used to live, there is a river separating the two countries, and there is a bridge like that. And half the bridge is completely rusty, you know, because there's also a small road actually for cars with holes in the road, in the street part where cars go, and the other half is just neat. It's perfectly flat. The fence there, the guardrail has been painted recently. Everything is kept well, so you can guess quite easily which part is Italy and which part is not. But apart from that, I mean, it's a separation between Italy and Italian-speaking Switzerland. So there isn't even a linguistic barrier as there is between the Germanic world and the Latin world in Belgium. And indeed, they are much more similar to each other than they like to admit, because they don't want to admit it. Clearly, the Swiss Italian don't want to be confused with Italians, you know. But there, I mean, the bitterness exists mainly for economical reasons, because you know, Switzerland is basically the richest country in Europe, or in the world indeed, on a per capita basis, and so it does attract many people from Italy or indeed from the surrounding countries. I mean, the same happens in Germany, in France, on the border with Germany and France. There are so-called frontaliers, that's in French. I'm not sure how you can call them in English, but people who basically come into Switzerland in the morning from Italy or Germany or France and work there during the day and then go back home at night, live in Italy indeed, or in the surrounding countries, where they can enjoy a much lower cost, you know, with a big fat Swiss check, you know, in their pocket. And this creates a lot of bitterness. I mean, it does back in Italy too, because people think they have it too easy, which they don't really in quite a few instances actually. And of course on the Swiss side, because they're wrongly so, they consider those people as rats. I mean, that's how the propaganda, the anti-immigrant, like I said, they're not even immigrants. That's how the propaganda of some far-right parties, not to break the tradition, describes them. They are the rats who come eat the precious Swiss cheese. And because apparently they might be lowering the salaries a bit, which I think is true in some instances, but mostly that's what they don't want to admit. Those people are more qualified than the locals, so they really need them, you know. That's especially true on the French and the German side, but in Italy too, on the Italian side too. They just need those workers. because they come and do things that they cannot do themselves, not because they don't want to, but because they're not qualified enough. Anyway, that's a parenthesis. But so there you have it. You know, the story of the difficult relationships between the two sides on the Italian-Swiss border in those small towns. Now, a third area, border area, where I've lived for a number of years, is that area that separates historic China, so to speak, so the historic plain where Chinese civilization developed. So that area and Tibet. I lived in a city, in this case it wasn't really a small town, it was a 15 million people megalopolis, but that is really at the foot of Tibet. And it's Chengdu, it's called Chengdu, if you've heard of it. Fantastic place. Had my best years there. But I realized that's a complete different animal for the story I want to tell today. And so I'm not going to discuss that today. I mean, I'm going to focus on Europe. I'm going to focus on Europe, and I'm going to give a counter-example to the two negative examples that I've just given to show you that basically I'm just rambling, I guess. Anyway, there is an area which I know relatively well, a border area between France and Belgium this time, where there doesn't seem to be much animosity. You know, there seems to be, on the contrary, quite a lot of exchanges and friendly neighborly relations. And the reason it is so, I think, is because first there's no revenge feeling involved, you know, like there is between the Flemish and the Walloons. There's no language barrier, you know, Dutch and French, because, by the way, of course, the Dutch have been learning forcefully French all those decades, whereas the French-speaking Belgians don't make any effort in that regard. But anyway, that's another thing. So there's no language barrier. There's no resentment due to economic imbalance, such as between Italy and Switzerland. So this helps regarding the Belgo-French border. And finally, I think there's also kind of a shared misery. You know, those are both areas that have a long industrial past that is now gone, and they are kind of dull and grim, I have to say. If you see the cities over there, they're not the most joyful places. There's quite a lot of social issues, and both are kind of looked down by the rest of the country. Actually, you know, the rest of France tends to consider the north, the far north, as you know, kind of cold and a bit simple and prone to drinking, which they are. I mean, those are the areas where the best beers in the world are produced. So what can you do? And the same goes for the Walloons, for the French speakers in Belgium. You know, they're just not liked by, well, both the Flemish, for the reasons I've just explained, but also they're not liked by by Brussels, you know, which is its own thing, you know, separate from the other two. And although mostly French speaking, it does look down on the Walloons as well. The Brussels people are not too nice towards them. So anyway, there's this shared misery, I guess, which makes it more easy for them to relate to each other, I imagine. So there's a counter-example, if you will. But back to this small town here, this small Austrian town across the border with Italy, where I'm at right now. I mean, I can sense here too that there isn't that much friendliness, you know, towards the other side. I mean, apart from the fact that the other side is partly German speaking too, and historically it is German speaking, but that's another subject that's too long to explain. But I mean, on the way here, I came here with the bus. As I got on the bus driver told me, as I was asking him for a ticket, English oder Deutsch oder English. You know, you can only speak German or English to me. I don't want your filthy Italian, you know? That's basically what he was implying. And then, I went with English. And he told me I had to buy the ticket at the station and to be quick because he had to leave in 1 minute. I couldn't buy it on the bus, which from what I know is not even true, by the way. Anyway, he really treated me like a great unwashed, you know, for the simple fact that I used Italian in his Austrian, in his trans-border Austrian bus. And you know, this reminds me a lot of my childhood in Flemish-speaking Belgium. So so this leads me to the point that I want to make actually in this video. Maybe stop rambling indeed and make a point. The point being that it's a question of identity. I mean, it's obviously an attempt by these people on the border to assert an identity which is not truly theirs either, you know. I mean, it is because of a lack of identity that they try to assert it. These border areas, these border towns, historically, they've had multiple identities because this is Europe, you know. We've been at war with each other since forever, apart from the last 80 years. Thanks America, thanks the EU. So borders have changed non-stop over the course of centuries, and these people on the border, they found each other on one side or the other side of our history, indeed, you know, depending on who was reigning, who was the ruler at that time. So they haven't had the time properly to forge a strong ancestral identity, you know, because that's how long it takes. I mean, again, this is Europe. You need centuries and centuries of sedimenting, you know, of creating a base and building on it, and they just haven't had it here, you know, on the border for those reasons. And you can see that, you can see it, although there's a medieval castle there. I was just gonna say they have no landmarks, you know, there's no visible landmarks or anything, but there's at least a fortress, which probably shows my ignorance of this area of Austria and Italy. But generally, I mean, especially in Italy, I mean, Italy is so diverse regionally. You know, if you know things or two about architecture, about the history of the cities of the various kingdoms, duchies, and all the influence there's been in the past, it is very diverse architecturally. You know, because a lot from the past is still present as well, and it is very different culturally, linguistically. Also, they speak very differently depending on where they are. They think very differently. They eat very differently. I mean, Italian cuisine. Let's not even get started. You know, and in these border towns, I mean, here it's Austria, but in Italy, like I said, the border towns in Italy are culturally, architecturally, culinarily poor, you know. I'm gonna stress on the culinarily, you know. Their cuisine is nothing to write home about. I mean, their local cuisine consists of a couple of local dishes, okay. And then in the supermarket you can find generic Italian products, which, by the way, the Austrians or the Swiss who come from across the border see as a new bonanza, you know, like they literally find paradise there when they see an Italian supermarket with so many delicacies and all. If only they knew, if only they took the time to go a bit further into, I'm not gonna say real Italy, but you know, more Italy, part of Italy that has been there for longer, you know, has been more stable and therefore has more to offer. If only they knew, but anyway, I digress. The point is, there is this lack of identity. The point, I think, is that they are trying to compensate this this lack of identity with an imaginary identity that relies on the wrong benchmarks. You know, because when you want to make it a point that over this line begins your territory, but on this side, this is where I am and different from you, well, you need obviously a benchmark, and your benchmark here is what? I mean, for the Italians, it's Rome, which is way behind here, way more to the south, and you know, in quite a different context. And for the Austrians, it's Vienna, which is also far away over there. And actually, I mean, yes, of course, that's where your national identity emanates from, but your true local identity is obviously here, and it's a shared identity that you both have, you know. I mean, that the line here in this big wide valley that you share is just a line indeed, you know. There's no physical separation, like I said. There's no sea or big mountain or whatever. So I don't know, I think really they should you know, instead of disliking each other and living separate lives next to each other, the obvious answer would be to embrace their common destiny somehow, you know, to like each other a bit more and to build a common border identity, you know, to develop it, to rethink it also. Why not? But none of that really seems to be happening, despite also the existence, you know, this is Europe. We are trying, at least we've been trying to make a united Europe for decades now. And Europe and the big bad EU, namely, has actually put in place such programs on these border areas between different member states. Notably the EURegio or EURegio programs. I mean, it's a made-up word, made up of Europe and region. It's a Latin word, obviously, a Latin portmanteau word, and those programs actually, they encompass border areas of Europe, and they promote cooperation, you know, economical, cultural, political, social, between border areas, such as in this case the EURegio of this area, whose name I forgot actually, but anyway, it encompasses a border area of Italy and of Austria and maybe also of Slovenia. I'm not quite sure. I know that in Belgium there's one big such you know, it's a sub-region that's being created basically between areas on the Belgian, Dutch and German border. Okay, and it seems to work relatively well there, I think. Although that's really the heart of modern Europe, so maybe it is to be expected more. I don't know. But yeah. Anyway, I think we can do better than that. That's all I'm thinking, really. You know, not that this is a pressing issue. I mean, it's more like a first world problem, you know. At least I guess there's no war anymore on this continent. We've been at, well, there is one big war more to the east, but people seem to forget about it. You know, but we are in a privileged part of the world, and I guess we could also very well keep on living like this, you know, just our own separate lives. But I don't know. Maybe there's more to it than that. You decide. You let me know. I would love to hear some comments if you've made it this far in the video. And until next time, take care. Bye bye.